Thank you very much. Well, Nicholas Dujmovic, CIA staff historian, joined the history staff in 2005, where he continues to research, write, and present on the full gamut of agency activities. His articles and book reviews on agency operations and culture have appeared in Studies in Intelligence and the journal Intelligence and National Security. In 2004, Yale University published his collection of quotations on intelligence and espionage titled The Literary Spy, which is wonderful if you haven't seen it already. He joined the CIA in 1990 as an analyst on the USSR and East Europe, which, by the way, if you haven't seen our map here in the hallway, the map was put up when the Kennedy Center was created in 1983. About once a week, we receive an email or a call or someone wanting to let us know that the USSR is still listed on our map. So we decided to preserve the map and are curating it with a display. This is the world as it was in 1983. So for those of you who don't remember that. He also served as a speechwriter for the Director of Central Intelligence, editor of the President's Daily Brief, and a manager of analysts. Nick also has had prior experience to his agency career. He was a seagoing officer in the U.S. Coast Guard and taught at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. He received a BS in government from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. As I mentioned before, he has been to BYU before, and we hope that he will come again. This will just be one of his many return visits. Speaking on new research in CIA history, please join me in welcoming Nicholas Dujmovic.
Thank you very much. I confess I'm always astounded that you keep inviting me back, so I figure it's the curiosity about the beard, or maybe, possibly, it's that the subject of CIA history is pretty interesting. I think it is, and I've made it later in my career, my life's work. But it's always a pleasure to come here. Partly because I get to try out new material here. One of my lectures here I turned into a journal article for Intelligence and National Security. And another presentation I gave the very last time is now appearing as a chapter in a book published by Oxford University Press called The Oxford Handbook of Strategic Intelligence, which is a compendium of various people's writings. My topic today is new research. These are the things that we're doing. And I have to always balance this sort of presentation with the reality that this is not what we do that is made publicly available. This is not our main work. The CIA history staff exists at CIA mainly for the CIA community to do classified research in problems that are still classified, come up with conclusions that end up being classified, and then presenting them to the cleared community there so they can learn something from the past, including our mistakes. That's our main job. But we're kind of amphibian in the sense that I'm both living in the water and on the land. I have one foot in the closed classified world doing, again, that's our primary work, and I have one foot out here in the wider world. Sometimes I have to be careful then of what I say, but we have a mission to try to explain this strange history of the agency to the wider world as well, and I'm always eager to do that. The three things I'm going to talk about today, the new research that we're conducting on the history staff that is publicly available, it's kind of a mixed bag. I have two topics that deal with probably the most interesting, certainly the most popular CIA history topic, and that's covert action. And the third one deals with Ronald Reagan as a user of intelligence. So that is my plan. I do presume a certain knowledge of history, American history, history of American foreign policy and national security since World War II. But if something I say that utterly baffles you, please raise your hand and allow for ask a question. I think this small group allows for a little more intimacy than we can with a larger group, so I see that as a positive thing. The first topic is actually not my research, but that of my boss. The chief historian of CIA is David Robarge. His work is eminently Googleable, if I can use that adjective. Robarge is R-O-B-A-R-G-E, David Robarge. And he's given a couple presentations, but is not published on this particular topic because it's controversial. It's CIA covert action as a force for democracy. How crazy is that? When he does publish on this, it will be controversial because, first of all, covert action, the implementation of U.S. foreign policy in a way that the hand of the United States is not apparent, that's what covert action is, it's always controversial. But also because Dr. Robarge overturns one of the entrenched myths about CIA covert action, and namely the myth runs like this, that out of our Cold War paranoid fear about communism, what Jimmy Carter called the inordinate fear of communism, we did bad things. We toppled popularly elected foreign leaders and replaced them with our guys, and our guys were thugs, pro-U.S. people who ended up being dictators. That's the straw man that Dr. Robarge decided to take on to see what truth there is in this. Because there is this popular conception that covert action, as practiced, as conducted by CIA, has been fundamentally anti-democratic. Let's look at first what is covert action. And the definition is it's an activity or activities conducted by the U.S. government, doesn't have to be CIA, but by tradition and responsibility and legality, it usually is, conducted by the U.S. government to influence political, economic, military conditions in a foreign country, abroad somewhere, where it is intended that the role of the U.S. government will either not be apparent or will not be acknowledged publicly. And there are various types of that. Propaganda, political action, trying to influence elections, providing subsidies for groups that we want to flourish, and then paramilitary activities, which include support for resistance fighters, it includes regime change, and so forth. I'll have more to say about paramilitary activities in the next section. It does not include, as a matter of law, anything, covert action is not conducting espionage, it's not conducting counterintelligence, it is not supporting diplomacy or military actions, it's not law enforcement, it's not other activities that support functions of the U.S. government. When Henry Kissinger went to China secretly to prepare the opening to China in the early 70s, it was secret, and it was so secret he didn't trust State Department communications. He used CIA communications. That's secret, but it's not covert action, okay, as a legal category. Now, a few more things before we get into the discussion. Historically, CIA covert action has been a small share of the budget, contrary to what some people seem to think, even though it gets the most attention. I think everyone would agree that it's politically sensitive and potentially embarrassing, and yet no president since Truman has forsworn it. It has been subjected historically to close congressional scrutiny, which is surprising to many. It is effective when employed properly, which I admit is somewhat tautological. It works well when it works well. But mainly it's often misunderstood and misused. Misunderstood because the successes often are kept secret, whereas the failures are the ones that get a lot of attention. And it's misused when U.S. decision makers have drawn the wrong conclusions from covert actions that have gone well. The covert action capability was initially developed in the Truman administration. It was under his administration that the National Security Act in 1947 was passed, creating CIA. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But under Truman and his successor, Eisenhower, the covert action capability was developed as a result of a perceived need to counter Soviet adventurism and expansionism, and to keep the Cold War cold. We had to do something. Nobody wanted to go nuclear or even overt military, so covert action is seen as this middle way. Now, a big part of the problem in the misperception of covert action is a result of two covert actions fairly early in the Cold War. Iran, 1953, where we restored the Shah of Iran to the throne, and Guatemala, 1954, where we removed the president of Guatemala and replaced him with somebody else. Because these things were seen at the time as successful, misconceptions started early about it. Intelligence scholar Gregory Treverton has said that Iran and Guatemala made the CIA's reputation and set the pattern for covert action in the years ahead. Small, cheap, fast, and tolerably secret, they encouraged U.S. policymakers to think other covert actions would be likewise. In other words, they convinced U.S. decision makers that they could make things happen in other countries easily, as a silver bullet. When in reality, both of these operations were very touch and go, could have gone the other way. It really was not a silver bullet. More lasting, for our purposes, is the more general perception that these were typical CIA covert actions, and that therefore CIA covert actions typically were anti-democratic. In 1953, we restored the Shah by removing the prime minister, who wasn't popularly elected, but he was popular. He was actually elected by the National Assembly. So this starts the perception that we take out popularly elected people in order to put in an anti-democratic dictator or thug. In Guatemala, the regime change involved the overthrow of a president who was elected in 1950 with 65% of the vote. Hard to get around that. Hard to get around that. Certainly looks, and I would argue is, anti-democratic. Now, Dr. Robarge has analyzed some 24 covert actions that have been publicly acknowledged by CIA or have been written about extensively by former CIA officers whose works were approved for publication, didn't have classified material in them, and therefore we can say, even though they're not publicly acknowledged, we can treat them. These 24 publicly or covert actions involve everything from propaganda to political action to paramilitary. From the Italian election of 1948, we helped the right people win, through the paramilitary operations in Afghanistan after 9/11. First people on the ground, first Americans on the ground in Afghanistan after 9/11 were CIA people, paramilitary. Now, I'll speak later about how this set of 24 is reflective of the ones we can't talk about, the bigger set of still secret covert actions. But for our purposes, after categorizing these 24 programs by what type of covert action they were, Dr. Robarge looked at what was it intended to do. What was each program's intent, whether it was successful or not. He looked at whether it was successful or not, but what did it intend to do with respect to democracy? And he identified 7 categories on sort of the democratic intent spectrum. The first 3, which he called the most democratic, involve, first one, remove the dictatorship and replace with democratic elements. That was the intention in Nicaragua in the 1980s, no matter what other people might say. That was the intention. That was the intention in Dominican Republic in the 60s. The second one, promote democracy within an existing dictatorship. That was the intent, and I would say a successful one, of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, broadcasting to the Soviet Union, the people of the Behind the Iron Curtain, Asia Foundation, which is now its own separate thing, but Asia Foundation was created to do much the same in Asia in the 50s. The third category of the most democratic categories here, protect or promote democracy against anti-democratic elements. In Italy and France in the late 40s, helping the more democratic people to win elections as opposed to the communists. You'll notice that the communists didn't take over either Italy or France despite a lot of strength, electoral strength. part of that must be credited to CIA. And there are others that we can talk about. In this middle range on the spectrum, the less democratic, we could include removing a dictatorship and replace with resistance people who are resisting the dictatorship. And this happened a lot. You know, we tried it in North Korea. We tried it in Tibet. We tried it in Albania, Afghanistan. We're not talking about replacing a dictatorship with Western-style Democrats. They may not be democratic at all, but they're seen at the time as being better than the existing alternative. Or promoting and protecting pro-U.S. elements who are resisting dictatorial forces. Operations in Vietnam and Laos during the Southeast Asian conflicts. And then we have, on the spectrum, the least democratic in intent, covert actions. Removing an elected leader or a popularly supported leader and replacing with another democratic leader. That does happen. You know, you subvert democracy in order to preserve democracy, I guess might be the theme. That was the first part of the Chile covert action in the 1970s. And then the least likable one, removing an elected or popularly supported leader and replacing him with pro-U.S. semi or non-democratic elements. This is the stereotype, but it's at the end of the spectrum. And that we can put Iran, Guatemala, Indonesia, the second part of the Chile operation, and so forth. So there you have it. And there's a spectrum. Now, Dr. Robarge looked at these 24 covert action programs and drew some conclusions. The most important of which is that far from being a standard tool of U.S. leaders to squelch democracy, in 70% of the cases, these cases of CIA covert actions, 70% were intended to promote or protect democracy or to resist dictatorship or dictatorial forces. A lot of examples of that. I mentioned Radio Free Europe, you know, Italy, France, the various fronts that we created to counter Soviet doings in the world, various cultural fronts, and so forth. That's the good news. The bad news is that about 30%, not quite 30%, were intended to thwart the people's will by ousting an elected or, again, popularly supported leader. And I've mentioned Iran, Guatemala, Chile, and so forth. Less than 20% were intended to keep our bad guys in power. So the actual percentage drops down to about a fifth of all of these covert actions, because sometimes when we removed a democratic leader, we put in another democratic leader that we liked better. Okay, so that's not quite as onerous as the worst case, which is taking out a leader and putting in somebody who ends up being a dictator. Now, looking at all these issues and whether they were successful, overall, about half the covert actions failed. It's a risky business. Less than 30% were successes in the long term. Paramilitary operations were the most likely to fail, and they also represent the most failures in a type. Pro-democratic covert actions correlated with long-term successes. Italy and France are still democratic. You know, the radios, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, had long-term effects that came to fruition in the democratic revolutions in East Europe in 1989. Now, what if we still consider, though, you know, we're talking about the covert actions we can talk about. What about the ones we can't talk about? What can we say about that? And our impression, and I have to admit, this is a case where I just have to say, trust me on this, because I can't offer data. I can't footnote it. I work in an absurd world in that sense. Our impression, based on what we know about, and we know a great deal about these covert actions we can't talk about, that the democratic quotient would actually increase. That 70% would go up. The good number would go up if we could talk about those, because the nasty covert actions are all known, and we tend to know more about failures. The ones that are secret tend to be successful and also tend to be more democratic, weighted towards democracy, at least in part because since 1980 there's been a requirement that Congress be briefed, and since the mid-'70s you've had something in Congress that you didn't have in early CIA history, and that was a Congress that was very anti-democratic. They just weren't going to tolerate some of these things for the sake of the Cold War anymore. So if we could talk about the secret stuff, then I think our democratic quotient would go up. But for now, all we can say is 70%, you know, if it's a batting average, it's great. But if it's, you know, the 30% still troubles a lot of people, and it should. It should. A lot of things were done during the Cold War because of the context of the times, that today we look back and say, you know, can't approve of that, but at least we can understand. The Cold War was a serious thing. Let me move to the second area of new research. And that deals specifically with this part of covert action that is the paramilitary function. The development of CIA's paramilitary capability and its use in the early Cold War. Paramilitary covert actions are the most controversial, not only for the public because they involve violence, but even among many people who think deeply and in a scholarly way about intelligence, and even among CIA officers. They don't seem to fit. Many say, if we're going to do these things, we shouldn't do it. The military ought to do it. It doesn't seem to fit in the intelligence cycle, you know, where you collect the information, you analyze it, make sense of it, provide it to the policymaker, he provides feedback. All along there's a counterintelligence kind of quality control to make sure your information is good. In that cycle, where does paramilitary, you know, covert actions come in? So some, even CIA professionals don't like paramilitary. They think it ought to be done somewhere else. And as we've seen from the previous discussion, paramilitary operations are risky. They tend to fail more than other types. They've been hard to keep secret. You know, the one that comes to mind immediately is the Bay of Pigs operation, the mother of all paramilitary failures. My question for my research is, where did this come from? Where did it come, this idea that we'll have paramilitary operations as a function of intelligence? Where does it come from? And the easy answer, the glib answer, is that, well, from OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. In World War II, the first time the United States had a centralized intelligence agency doing the full service, if you will, of collection, analysis, counterintelligence, and covert action, including paramilitary operations. They had 3 paramilitary branches. One, the Special Operations Group, parachuted very small groups, 2 and 3 people at a time, into occupied France, link up with the French resistance, go kill some Nazis, blow up bridges. That's what they did. Another group was the operational group, and these were uniformed commandos, essentially, of 30 to 100 in a group, usually bilingual. You know, for the Greek theater, we would put Greek Americans in uniform in OSS to operate in that operational group. There was a third paramilitary branch known as the Maritime Unit, and it's interesting that both our current National Clandestine Service within CIA and the Special Forces in the military both claim their lineage from these OSS paramilitary branches. I mean, that's kind of how close the activity is. And in fact, the SEALs draw their legacy from this maritime unit of OSS. So that's where it was, but OSS was disbanded in October 1945, and we don't see evidence of paramilitary capability on the part of CIA until June of 1948. There's this 30-month gap. Well, as I approached the problem, I just assumed there had to be a hidden paramilitary capability. Somebody engaged in a shell game to hide it. That was my assumption. I found out I was wrong. And it's good to find out once in a while that you're wrong. I mean, I figured that somebody must have realized that with this Cold War developing, things not going well with our former allies, the Soviets, that we would need some kind of clandestine paramilitary capability. I was mostly wrong. There was a half-hearted attempt on the part of a few to preserve something of a paramilitary capability as an intelligence function, but generally, it seems so far in my research that the capability was basically lost in the aftermath of World War II because there wasn't a perceived need for it. So in September, if you think of two organizations 2 years apart, OSS in September of 45 about to be disbanded, but it's a full-service intelligence organization, collection, including espionage, analysis, counterintelligence, covert action, including paramilitary. And then you have CIA in September of 47 being created, mostly full service, has everything that the OSS did except a paramilitary capability. In between what's going on are a couple transitional agencies, and you have to be really into post-war intelligence history in a big way to even be able to track this. But basically what happened is that after disbanding OSS, President Truman realized he needed somebody just to collate intelligence, coordinate the analysis. That was the problem with the Pearl Harbor surprise, that the information was there, but it wasn't coordinated and shared. Arguably, that's also what happened in 9/11. But anyway, back to 47, or 46, when Truman creates, by the stroke of a pen, executive order, the Central Intelligence Group to do analysis, coordination, and estimates. Meanwhile, OSS is disbanded, but you can't just take an organization and scatter it to the four winds. I mean, there has to be a process of demobilization. There are resources to be liquidated. And this went to basically a holding tank in the War Department called the Strategic Services Unit. It was created to administer this process. Well, the good bureaucrats in SSU did what good bureaucrats always do. They drag their heels. They realized that we need to preserve, because a central intelligence agency is coming, given how the Cold War is going, we need to preserve espionage, and we need to preserve counterintelligence assets, that's stations, files, people with expertise, and so forth. And that was the intent. And I figured that these good bureaucrats would do the shell game with paramilitary capabilities. But as it turns out, they didn't. And I found indisputably the table of organization, which shows all these people going from the OSS espionage branch and counterintelligence branch into SSU to be preserved. But the paramilitary branches were disbanded, and out of hundreds of people in these branches, exactly three were retained under espionage. There was no paramilitary organization. There were 3 people with expertise, and they're brought in to help preserve this paramilitary capability. Well, that's not a preservation at all. That's checking a box, perhaps bureaucratically. These transitional agencies, SSU, eventually merged into CIG, and with the National Security Act in 1947, CIG became CIA. The National Security Act also created other things that we're familiar with, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. No more Secretary of War, we're now in defense. The National Security Council to oversee national security policy, particularly intelligence. The U.S. Air Force, which most people count as a good thing. And that's a joke. That's it. Right after CIA has stood up in the fall of 47, however, the National Security Council says, we've got to do something about what the Soviets are up to. We need to institute covert psychological warfare. And nobody really knew what this meant. They knew that it involved propaganda and influence activities, trying to get elections to go the way we wanted them to, and so forth, but not paramilitary, not violent things. The push to have CIA do covert action that included paramilitary functions or operations, it came from an unlikely source, the State Department of all places, because George Kennan was chief of policy planning there. George Kennan, of course, famous Mr. X, the author of the article Sources of Soviet Conduct that outlined and made him the architect of our containment policy, which arguably sustained us through the Cold War. He, in 1946, was arguing for measures short of war. Nobody wants to go to war, but measures short of war to contain the Soviets. He's doing this in lectures at the National War College. In 1947 and 8, he's chief of policy planning, very influential position. He's advocating for covert political warfare, and he uses the term warfare deliberately. That would include the new phrase, preventive direct action, sabotage, demolition, support to resistance groups, paramilitary. Now, state got its way. Defense, for its part, didn't want anything to do with peacetime paramilitary operations. And in fact, defense wouldn't create a special forces until 1952. They were very much in transition, too, about this irregular warfare concept. Finally, in June of 48, the National Security Council, through its Directive 10/2, creates a covert action organization in CIA, not entirely of CIA, but in CIA, called the Office of Policy Coordination, named in that bland way to confuse everyone, and charged it with preventive direct action, this paramilitary function. So suddenly, in June of 48, we have this mandate and an organization to carry out these paramilitary activities. Now, why does this all matter? Why does it matter that between the dissolution of OSS in 1945 and 30 months later, CIA in the mid-48, we effectively have no paramilitary organization or capability or mandate, paramilitary as an intelligence mission. I think it matters because in the first 10 years or so of the Cold War, we end up being rather bad at paramilitary operations. Remember, they're the ones that tend to fail the most. And this 30-month gap, I think, at least helps to explain, it certainly didn't help matters, but I think it helps to explain why one CIA paramilitary operation after another in those first Cold War years failed, in contrast with OSS paramilitary operations, which were relatively successful. What happened? Well, I think we dropped the ball on resources. And I could talk more about some of what some of those paramilitary failures were. We had several in Europe, in Asia, in the early 50s. Guatemala was a partial success. It was a paramilitary, the paramilitary part was going to fail until the propaganda and political action kicked in. And I also, in my research, have found that as OPC, this covert action body, is expanding in the early 50s, that they're devoting very little, about 3% of their personnel, formally to paramilitary. So there's a lot of paramilitary activity going on. It's not being done by people with expertise, and I think that's probably part of the reason. I have a lot more to do on this before I present this at Virginia Military Institute next month, but that's the second one. The third, which we have a little time for, basically Reagan as a user of intelligence. This is a project that we are co-sponsoring with the Reagan Library down in Simi Valley, California. We're identifying documentation, intelligence reports that were read by senior officials in the Reagan administration and seemed to help. It's always hard, and especially in intelligence, to establish causality, that this report caused or had an effect on this policy. But we're trying to do some of that. And we hope to have all this ready for a conference in the fall of next year, 2011. 2011 will be 30 years since Ronald Reagan became president. That's amazing to me. It's also the 100th anniversary of his birth. Now, all this is going to add to a growing trend in scholarship, which actually gives Reagan more credit than he's received thus far, for helping to end the Cold War. There have been recent books by journalists who have been very critical of Reagan in the past, and now they are reluctantly having to give Reagan some credit for vision and actual work towards reducing the nuclear threat, improving relations with the Soviet Union, and help manage the Cold War to a successful end. This is revisionism. Reagan, according to the earlier scholarship of the 1990s, was not very engaged, wasn't even very smart, never read anything, didn't have an original thought. And whatever happened to the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War was accidental. He can claim no credit. That's the original scholarship. The new scholarship is revisionism, and revisionism is good if it gets us closer to the truth. What does this have to do with CIA history? Well, if President Reagan was actively engaged in trying to bring about the end of the Cold War by putting pressure on the Soviet Union, presumably his policies were informed by intelligence, and that's what we're trying to find out. It also means that the stereotype of Reagan as a user of intelligence is wrong. This is sort of a subset of the earlier scholarship. The scholarship has treated him unfavorably with regards to intelligence. It said that he came to the presidency knowing nothing about intelligence other than what he learned making movies. Because he's allegedly not a reader, he has no patience for any long or sophisticated intelligence analysis beyond his daily CIA briefing. About that daily briefing, it's very often said that Reagan, the former Hollywood actor, didn't read that either. He got it in video form. We made videos for him. Now, even those scholars, like Christopher Andrew, who are much better on Reagan than the traditional scholarship, he says in his very good, still good book, For the President's Eyes Only, that Reagan actually read the daily CIA report, but he had a source that said it wasn't very long, you know. So we even have to dumb down that report to 700 or 800 words. Now, reviewing the documentary evidence, including still classified CIA records, I've been able to conclude that every single one of these assertions is wrong. Reagan came to the presidency knowing a great deal about intelligence because he served on the Rockefeller Commission, the first in-depth, high-level investigation of U.S. intelligence activities. And Reagan, there are stories about Reagan helping to draft the final report. He apparently synthesized a lot of the material in his head, and then when they were at loggerheads, he said, well, fellas, why don't we start this way? And he started writing, and that started the drafting process. Over the next, that part is known, over the next 5 years, he had a weekly radio commentary that recent scholarship has shown was often insightful, sophisticated, commentary on a wide range of subjects, including intelligence, and those are pretty good. Recent scholarship has established that Reagan was, in fact, a great reader. And we must include in that assessment intelligence reports. Director of CIA Bill Casey would give Reagan 15 to 20 page single-spaced memoranda that every indication is Reagan would read, usually before a trip, and that's long for any president. More interestingly, I found there was a weekly menu from CIA of reports published in the last week, 5 to 7 reports, titles, and a one-sentence summary. And Mr. President, if you want any of these, let us know. He would typically check, of the 5 to 7 listed, he would check 1, 2, or even 3 to read. On one list, he wrote, "Send me another copy." And the title of that, and I can say it because it's been declassified, was "Depressed Trajectories, Unlikely Role for Soviet SLBMs." This is serious stuff. This was our assessment that the Soviets really could not depress the trajectory of a submarine-launched ballistic missile, thereby giving U.S. decision makers less time to react in case of a nuclear strike. And there are other examples I could do. My favorite, though, is early in the presidency, and this is borne out in his diaries, where Reagan was genuinely and almost in a childlike way surprised at the perks of the presidency. He was surprised that they had clean white shirts for him on Air Force One, you know, and didn't mind that he wasn't surprised at being surprised, but he didn't care. He wrote it down. I was surprised at this. Well, he got one of his first menus, and he wrote on it. This is the President of the United States. He wrote on it, "Could I have these?" And he checked 3 of the 7 there. "Could I have these?" He's the president. And I think he realized, wait, I'm the president, because he underlined it. And then he wrote, have the Situation Room routinely send all these to me, which is very ambitious, and I think that fell off, and I think he was probably told at some point, Mr. President, you can't read everything that we offer to you, so, please be careful in your choice. In another one, he requested 3 of the 5 reports offered: Soviet views on European security, implications of the Soviet gas pipeline to Western Europe, and the health of a particular royal family. This is serious stuff, and he's reading it, and he's initialing it and dating it. We see a lot of examples of that, not only from CIA, but from the National Intelligence Council. Nobody should read full national intelligence estimates. He gets a presidential summary, but he'd read it and sign off on it. On the videos issue, I actually did an inventory of all the videos we produced during that period and came up with a number of 49, which means that if Reagan saw every CIA video, he would have seen one every 2 months. He read the daily briefing. It was not a video presentation. And the marks, because we got him back, the marks on the presidential copy, number 1, show an interested, engaged reader who comments, who brackets things, who draws exclamation marks. I was hoping to find doodles. I didn't find any doodles. And in one report, he detected a contradiction. I'm a former PDB editor, so I would have been mortified to learn that in an article, a 2-page article on Soviet negotiating stance on conventional forces in Europe, he underlined a particular point, very closely argued piece. He underlined a particular point, turned the page, it's bound at the top, turned the page, read along, and then found a point that seemed to contradict what was on page 1. He underlined it and said, is this a misprint? Why is this? So, I mean, they used to call, at CIA, they used to call Jimmy Carter the chief grammarian because he would correct grammar. But here's a president on a substantive point, a close reader, finding something that fairly highly paid civil servants should have caught, did not catch. This is a different Reagan than you may have been led to believe. And finally, the length of his daily briefing report was typically 3 times what even our dear friend Christopher Andrew has alleged in his book, and I'll certainly make a point of it next time I see him. I'm also very interested in the Reagan-Casey relationship. It's been said that Casey was an intimate friend, saw him all the time. I think I suspect that, like much in Casey's life, it's exaggerated. I looked at his records. The people at that level have their movements and calls and meetings pretty well documented. And going through the first calendar year of the presidency, from the inauguration, January 20th, 1981, to the end of the year, 31 December, I have found that Casey saw Reagan quite a bit in all the NSC meetings, the National Security Policy Group meetings, the cabinet meetings. In other words, with others. He only had, in that period, 5 individual meetings with the president, and there were only 6 phone calls. So I'm thinking that maybe we need to reassess that relationship. And more could be said about that. At this point, that is essentially the substantive work that we can talk about that we're doing on the history staff. We're doing a lot of internal stuff, as is our primary mission. In addition, we're helping the declassifiers get out more material to our website, historical material, 6 previously classified internal histories on CIA activities in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and Laos, about 1,600 pages. A monograph on the A-12 supersonic reconnaissance plane that was the predecessor to the SR-71. Reporting from our one of our assets, Colonel Kuklinski, on martial law in Poland. Forthcoming, we're working on the record of our Korea analysis in 1950. We blew it. We want to see how, why, how bad it was. The Soviet invasion of the Czech Republic in 1968, and we're also trying to get out more of the previously classified studies and intelligence articles. A lot more that could be said, but I just think you've probably heard enough, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have on any aspect of CIA history that I can answer. We have a mic here because this is being. I think, Corey, I got through this without saying, tripping over the line and saying anything that we'd have to edit out. So I think I live in an absurd world. Be very careful sometimes. Yes, sir.
Okay, my name is Chad Turner, and I'm an international relations major.
Good for you.
And I recently read a book that you recommended on a previous visit called The Secret Life about Colonel
Kuklinski.
Yes,
What'd you think of that book?
I rather enjoyed it. I thought it was really good.
It kind of reads like a spy novel, doesn't it?
It does. It reads
it's entirely
very
true.
much like a novel.
Yeah.
It was very good. And as you finished up your speech, you mentioned that there would be reports on the martial law findings, the things that the intelligence that he provided. What type of records are going to be made public?
They're already out there, actually, on our site. If you go to the our website could stand some re-engineering, but if you go to CIA.gov and click on library, there's a choice for it's electronic reading room for Freedom of Information Act, and in there they have special collections listed, and the Colonel Kuklinski's reporting on preparations for that the communist Polish government was undertaking before it declared martial law, which was a huge thing, and ultimately led to the communists' own undoing, thankfully. That is there as a special collection that has been declassified. More important, though, were Kuklinski's, I mean, you've read the book, Kuklinski's reporting on Warsaw Pact plans, capabilities, command and control arrangements. I mean, because of what this man provided on those topics, as opposed to martial law, if there had been, and thank God there wasn't, but if there had been a war between NATO and Warsaw Pact, I think we would have won pretty handily because we knew where everything was. Thanks to this colonel who was in the belly of the beast. He was on the Polish general staff. And it's a very good story. Again, thank you for bringing it up. Benjamin Weiser, A Secret Life. It's a good book. We're actually going to make an internal documentary on Colonel Kuklinski that we hope will eventually be released to the public. Okay. Yes, sir, in the back.
Hi, Jason Olson. I'm graduating from BYU this semester and moving on to do a PhD at Brandeis University in Middle Eastern and Israeli Studies.
Wow.
And I just wanted to know, just from your experience, what you suggest as far as preparations to, so that I could become qualified to do a job as an analyst or even a staff historian in the CIA.
I won't speak to staff historian. That's a very strange road to come along, and there's no typical path. But for an analyst, I started out as an analyst, as you heard. I would get as good as you possibly can in your chosen field, and that includes with languages. Know how to write, and I know they teach writing here at BYU. I mean, they expect it. Hopefully you're taught before you get to college. But those skills are absolutely important and critical. If you've got that, you know, I would be confident that you would have a place there. CIA.gov does list the sorts of jobs that we're looking at currently. I'm not telling you to ignore that, but we're always looking for good people, and we'll find places for good people. So it's a very interesting line of work you're getting into. Yeah. Okay. Can I? Anything else? All right. Well, this is partly how your tax dollars are spent, so I hope it's worth it. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure being here. Yeah.